My mother kicked me out of the house so that my brother could live there for free. But when he was discovered committing fraud, everything ended up in my name. I never thought that the person who would stab me in the back most cruelly wouldn't be a stranger or a declared enemy, but the woman who gave me life. The idea of family always seemed to me like a kind of safety net, a refuge where, despite differences and conflicts, one could count on some loyalty. But over time, I learned that not all mothers are protective, that not all siblings are allies, and that sometimes the worst mistake one can make is to give everything for those who never intended to return even a fraction. My story begins long before the final betrayal, in a house that theoretically belonged to my mother, but which in practice had been sustained by my efforts since I was a teenager. I knew that if I wanted something in life, I had to work twice as hard. My mother had a clear favorite, my younger brother. There was always an excuse to justify his behavior, always an argument to minimize his mistakes, while I was held to high standards without even the right to complain. What I earned with part-time jobs went to the house, first in small things, food, bills, repairs, and later in larger contributions. Years later, when I got a good job, when I finally had the opportunity to contribute financially so that my mother could pay the mortgage on the house, I did it without hesitation. Seemed fair to me. At that time, I still believed in the idea that family takes care of each other, that helping my mother was an investment in our stability. But what I saw as a sacrifice for the well-being of everyone, she saw as something natural, as if it were my obligation. I knew it the day she simply told me I had to leave. There was no discussion, no beating around the bush. With the coldness of someone announcing the weather, my mother said that my brother needed the house, and that I, having a job, could manage on my own. She said it with such naturalness that for a second I thought I had misheard. But no, she repeated it with conviction, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. It didn't matter the years I had spent helping with the payments, it didn't matter that my name appeared on house documents as one of those responsible for the financing. Nothing mattered except that her youngest son, that parasite who had never worked a day in his life, needed a place to live without worrying about expenses. Rage and disbelief mingled in my chest as I tried to find a logical reason, something to justify such an absurd decision. My mother simply insisted that I was independent, that it didn't make sense for me to continue living there when my brother needed it more. There wasn't a single ounce of remorse on her face. It was obvious that she had planned it in advance, and that she didn't expect resistance. For her, it wasn't a request or a suggestion, it was a fait accompli. When I tried to reason with her, reminding her that part of the money she had used for the house came from me, she just shrugged. "That's in the past," she said with an indifference that chilled me to the bone. The most absurd thing was when she added that I always did well, as if the fact that I worked meant that I had to carry everything while my brother lived off of others. She gave me no choice. I left with what little I could carry, feeling a knot of bitterness in my chest, a rage I had nowhere to direct. They kicked me out as if I were an uncomfortable tenant, as if the years of sacrifice meant nothing. And while my mother got rid of me without a second thought, my brother settled into the house with all the comforts in the world, without any plan to work or contribute a single cent. That day I learned a lesson in life. There are those who only see you as a resource. No matter how much you give, it will never be enough for those who only know how to take. But what my mother and my brother never imagined was that eventually fate would take a turn that would put everything in its place. Because when everything collapsed, when the house of cards they built on my sacrifices fell apart, it was I who ended up with absolute control. And this time there was no mercy. Update 1. 6 months may seem like an insignificant amount of time when life goes on as normal, but when everything falls apart, every day counts. For me, those 6 months were a stage of reconstruction, a period in which I had to adapt to a reality that, although painful, allowed me to free myself from the dead weight that my family represented. For my mother and my brother, on the other hand, it was the beginning of the end, the slow but sure collapse of the bubble of comfort in which they had lived at the expense of others. When they kicked me out of the house, I was forced to improvise. I didn't have a financial cushion solid enough to move to a comfortable place immediately, so I had to settle for what I could afford. A small, barely furnished apartment with rent that took a good chunk of my salary. It wasn't the ideal place, but it was mine. At least here I didn't have to deal with the constant shadow of my mother's favoritism, or the parasitic presence of my brother. Unlike them, I worked. My job, although demanding, gave me stability, and over time I was able to improve my situation. It wasn't easy. The feeling of having been betrayed by my own mother didn't disappear overnight. There were nights when the rage returned with force, in which I imagined scenarios where I told them everything I thought, in which I fantasized about the idea that one day they would need me and I would simply cross my arms. And that day came sooner than I imagined. The first signs of collapse were not immediate. At first, my mother and my brother enjoyed their new dynamic. My mother continued working, although she reduced her hours more and more because, according to her, she no longer had to worry about supporting 2 children. My brother, of course, didn't lift a finger to help with expenses. He lived in the house as if he were a king, expecting my mother to cover everything while he dedicated himself to what he had always done. Nothing. The problems began to appear in the form of small cracks. First, it was the services. Late payments, temporary cuts in electricity and water that my mother justified as oversights. Then came the complaints from the neighbors, who no longer tolerated the noise and irresponsibility of my brother. But the real sign that the situation was going downhill came when my mother tried to contact me. The first attempt was subtle, a casual message asking how I was, as if she was suddenly interested in my well-being. I ignored the message without a second thought. After all, why would I answer? Had she bothered to worry when she kicked me out of the house without even giving me time to prepare? A few days later, the strategy changed. This time it was a call. I didn't answer. Then another and another. Finally, a more direct message. Can you call me? I need to talk to you. It was no longer a casual question, but a plea disguised as cordiality. Something inside me told me that this was just the beginning. And I was right. I didn't know the details immediately, but what I found out later confirmed what I suspected. My mother was in financial trouble. Without my contribution, her income was not enough to cover the mortgage and all the expenses of the house. My brother, of course, continued to contribute nothing. The house began to deteriorate because they no longer had money to make the necessary repairs. The situation was unsustainable, and finally my mother realized something that, in her arrogance, she never considered when she decided to kick me out. I was the only one who had really kept that house afloat. Rumors began to reach me through relatives. An aunt, always involved in other people's lives, let the information slip in a conversation with a cousin. Your mom is having a hard time, you know? The house is a mess and your brother does nothing. I think they're behind on the mortgage. Hearing those words, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and resentment, not because I wanted to see them suffer. Well, maybe a little, but because this only confirmed what I always knew. My mother bet everything on my brother, believing that she could sustain the house with him, and now she was paying the price of her decision. And best of all, this was just the beginning. The messages and calls continued, increasingly insistent, until one day my desperate mother decided to put aside her pride and sent me a message that made her intentions clear. Can we talk? It's important. I didn't answer. Not because I wasn't curious, but because I wanted her to feel what I felt when she left me on the street without a second thought. I wanted her to understand what it means to be ignored when help is most needed. Update 2. A year can be a sigh or an eternity depending on which side of the story you're on. For me, it was enough time to settle down, to leave behind any vestige of guilt that I might have felt at some point, and to watch with a mixture of satisfaction and disdain as life took care of settling accounts for me. For my mother and my brother, on the other hand, it was the beginning of absolute decline, the downward spiral that, although predictable to anyone with a minimum of common sense, they never saw coming. Contact with my mother had ceased completely. After several ignored calls, unanswered messages, and failed attempts to reach me through relatives, I suppose she finally understood that I had no intention of coming to her aid, which didn't mean I didn't know what was going on. Thanks to certain aunts who couldn't help but meddle in other people's lives, I was aware of the situation they were in. The house was practically in ruins. The debts had accumulated to the point where the collectors no longer bothered to send letters but appeared directly at the door demanding payments that my mother could not make. What did surprise me was what I discovered about my brother. It all started with an old friend from college, someone I had lost contact with, but who by chance found me on social media and decided to write to me. After catching up with the typical work life, the inevitable "we should get together one of these days," that neither of us really planned to fulfill, the conversation took an unexpected turn. By the way, he wrote in a tone that even in text denoted a certain reserve. I think I saw your brother involved in something weird. I'm not sure, but his name sounds familiar from some documents at the company where I work. At first, I didn't understand what he meant. My brother had never worked at anything serious, much less something that had to do with business documents. But when I asked him to explain, my friend told me something that left me stunned. According to him, a problem had arisen at the company where he worked with a series of forged documents. They were altered payroll records, contracts that should never have existed, and bank records indicating that someone was diverting money fraudulently. During the internal audit, a name appeared several times, linked indirectly but suspiciously: my brother's. I couldn't believe it. Not because I thought my brother was incapable of something like that, but because I had never seen him make the slightest effort to earn money in any way. He was a parasite, yes, but a lazy parasite. This was something more sophisticated, something that required a level of planning and audacity that I hadn't attributed to him. I decided to investigate on my own. I knew that I wasn't going to get answers directly from him, so I looked for information wherever I could. I asked some acquaintances, checked social networks, and little by little the pieces began to fit. It turns out that my brother, without my knowledge, had been playing at being an entrepreneur. Or at least that's what he told my mother. According to her, he was working on important business, which, in her language, meant that he was involved in something shady. It didn't take me long to discover that what he was really doing was forging documents to obtain loans and open bank accounts with false identities. He was dedicated to scamming small businesses, making them believe that they were dealing with a legitimate client, only to disappear with the money before they could realize the fraud. But worst of all, what really sent a shiver of anticipation down my spine was discovering that he wasn't just using his name in these dirty dealings. He was using my mother's as well. Somehow, he had involved her in the fraud. I don't know if he did it with her consent or if he simply took advantage of her trust and naivete, but in the documents that my friend managed to show me, there were signatures from my mother in several suspicious transactions. For a moment I hesitated. I thought about the possibility of warning her, of telling her what I had discovered before it was too late. But then I remembered. I remembered her cold stare when she told me I had to leave, her indifference when I mentioned that I had contributed to the house, her certainty that she could do without me because she had her favorite son to support her. Update 3. 3 months passed since I discovered my brother's fraud before everything exploded. During that time I watched from a distance as my mother and her golden boy continued to sink, clinging to an illusion of stability that had long ceased to exist. The house was on the verge of foreclosure, the bank accounts were practically at zero, and my mother, in her desperation, had resorted to informal loans that only worsened her situation. She didn't know it yet, but her real nightmare was about to begin. The fall began with an unexpected visit. One day, while checking my phone during a break at work, I saw a message from one of my aunts. We didn't talk often, but this time her tone was different, urgent. "Have you seen the news? There's a serious problem with your brother. I think you should know." I immediately looked for information and found it on a local news channel. They mentioned a case of corporate fraud in which several small companies had been scammed with fake contracts, manipulated documents, and non-existent transactions. No names were mentioned yet, but the details matched perfectly with what I already knew. That same day the bomb exploded. A call from an unknown number interrupted my workday. I don't usually answer numbers I don't recognize, but something inside me told me that this time I should. On the other end of the line, my mother's voice sounded unrecognizable, trembling and broken. "They've arrested your brother." For a few seconds I didn't say anything. Not because I didn't know what to answer, but because I was enjoying the moment. My mother, the same woman who kicked me out of the house without remorse, who ignored all the sacrifices I made, was now begging me to do something. She told me between sobs that the police had raided the house that morning with an arrest warrant, taking my brother away in handcuffs while the neighbors watched the spectacle with morbid interest. The officers confiscated documents, computers, and any evidence that could incriminate him further. The most devastating thing for my mother was to learn, in the cruelest way, that her son was not the business genius she believed, but a simple criminal. But the worst part was yet to come. When the police reviewed the fraudulent transactions, they found something that made the case even more serious: the documents with my mother's signature. At that moment, she ceased to be just the mother worried about an irresponsible son. and became an accomplice in an investigation for financial fraud. It didn't matter if she signed the documents without knowing it, or if she blindly trusted her son. For the law, she was part of the scheme. The desperation in her voice was evident. She said she didn't understand anything, that it had all been a mistake, that her son couldn't have done something like that. She tried to justify herself in 1,000 ways, but none of her excuses changed reality. She was in very serious trouble, and this time there was no one who could save her. The moment I had waited for so long had arrived. "And what do you want me to do?" I asked with the coldness she had shown me when she kicked me out of the house. There was no immediate answer, only choked sobs before she tried to compose herself. "Please, I need help. I don't know what to do. I have no one else." There was the perfect irony. Me, the son who wasn't enough, the one who could manage on his own, the one who was discarded as if he didn't matter, was now the only person she could turn to. I didn't answer immediately. I let her feel the anguish, let the silence become unbearable. Finally, I told her what I had been waiting months to say. "I can't help you. I'm busy with my life, as you told me to do when you kicked me out." The conversation ended there. I learned from other relatives that my mother tried to seek help by all means, but no one wanted to get involved. Some tried to convince her that her son should pay for what he did. Others simply didn't have the resources to rescue her. The final blow came a few weeks later when the house was finally foreclosed on by the bank. With the mortgage unpaid and the accounts frozen by the investigation, there was no way to avoid it. They lost the house they had defended so much, the same one they kicked me out of. The difference was that I had rebuilt myself, they hadn't. The last time I heard from my mother, she was living at a friend's house, trying to avoid total disaster. My brother, on the other hand, was facing legal proceedings that could lead him to prison for several years. Update 4. A few weeks passed since the house officially ceased to belong to my mother and passed into the hands of the bank. During that time, I dedicated myself to monitoring the foreclosure process, as if I were watching the outcome of a play that I myself had written. I knew that sooner or later the property would go up for auction, and when that happened I would be ready. I had no interest in the house itself. It wasn't a place I wanted to recover out of attachment or nostalgia. In fact, if I could have, I would have reduced it to rubble with my own hands. But there was something about the idea of taking away the last thing they had left, of becoming the owner of what they had protected so much at the cost of my sacrifice, that was too tempting to ignore. The process was easier than I expected. Given that the house was in poor condition and had accumulated debts, its value at auction was much lower than normal. Thanks to the savings I had accumulated during my time away from them, I had no trouble making the winning bid. In a matter of days, the property became mine, something I confirmed when I received the official documents. My mother, of course, had no idea what had just happened. The moment of revelation came when I decided to pay a visit to the house. Although they no longer lived there, my mother still went from time to collect the little she had not been able to take before the bank took possession. I suppose that in her mind there was still the possibility that everything would be resolved, that there was some mistake, that her luck would change overnight. When I arrived, I found her standing at the entrance, looking at the facade with an expression of defeat that I had never seen on her face before. The haughty, self-assured woman who kicked me out without remorse was now a shadow of her former self. She didn't greet me immediately. She just looked at me with a mixture of surprise and distrust. Finally, in a trembling voice, she asked what I was doing there. "I came to see my house," I replied with the coldness with which she had stripped me of my home months earlier. Her face contorted into an expression of disbelief. She blinked several times as if my answer didn't make sense. "What are you talking about?" she murmured, almost in a whisper. I took the documents out of my bag and held them in front of her. "I bought it at auction. It's mine now." The reaction was immediate. My mother staggered back as if I had hit her physically. Her gaze went from the paper to me several times, looking for some sign that I was joking, but there was no trace of mockery on my face, only a cold and contained satisfaction. No, it can't be," she stammered, clinging to the door as if her mere presence could give her back the property she had lost. This isn't fair." Laughter escaped my throat before I could contain it. "Not fair," I repeated, feeling a wave of satisfaction run through me. Does that phrase sound familiar? Because a year ago you told me exactly the same thing when you kicked me out of here without a second thought. My mother opened her mouth, but no sound came out. In her eyes, I could see the exact moment she understood the magnitude of what had happened. Not only had she lost the house, but the person she had most despised now had absolute control over her. She tried to appeal to compassion, to a sense of family that she had never shown when the situation was in her favor. "Please," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I have nowhere to go. I can't afford another place. You have a job, you have money, you can do something for me, for your family." The irony of her words almost made me laugh again. "My family," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "That didn't seem to matter to you when you decided I was expendable." My mother started to cry, begging in a way I never imagined she would. But there wasn't a single hint of real remorse in her, only desperation. She wasn't asking for help because she recognized her mistake, but because she had no other choice. And I had no intention of saving her. "I want you out of here in less than 5 minutes, I said calmly, crossing my arms as I watched her collapse. She didn't move. Maybe she thought she could convince me that over time I would change my mind. But what she didn't understand was that for me, this wasn't an impulsive decision. It was the culmination of a long process, a meticulous revenge that I had waited for patiently. When it became clear that she wasn't leaving, her desperation turned to fury. She insulted me, called me ungrateful, told me that one day I would regret what I was doing. But her words had no power over me. All it did was confirm that she had never felt true affection for me. She only saw me as a resource that she could no longer exploit. When she finally left, I didn't look back. The last trace of the woman who gave me life disappeared from my sight as I stood in front of the house we once shared, knowing that from that moment on, everything had changed. My brother was in prison, my mother was on the street, and I had what they had protected so much. Final update. Several months have passed since the day my mother walked away from the house without looking back. Since then, the feeling of victory has settled in my chest with a mixture of satisfaction and relief. It wasn't an immediate burst of joy or momentary happiness. It was a lasting certainty, the kind of peace that only comes when outstanding accounts are finally settled. The house, the same one they kicked me out of as if I were a stranger, was now completely mine. And best of all, I hadn't had to do anything outside the law to get it. Everything unfolded with the precision of a deserved punishment, as if life itself took care of adjusting the pieces in my favor. I soon made a decision about the property. For me, that place wasn't a home or a symbol of good memories. It was a wound, a constant reminder of my mother's betrayal and contempt. But it was also a trophy, tangible proof that I had won. So, instead of letting it continue to deteriorate with the weight of its history, I renovated it. I hired workers, fixed the damage, painted the walls, replaced pipes, and eliminated any trace of my mother and brother's existence in that space. With each renovation, with each wall demolished or restored, I felt a little more liberated from their shadow. By the time the repairs were finished, the house was no longer the same one I grew up in. It was a new property, cleansed of everything that once made it a hostile place for me. But the best came later. When the renovations were ready, I didn't keep the house. I had no interest in living there, not when I had built my own life elsewhere. So I decided to rent it out. The irony was delicious. The same house my mother had kicked me out of without hesitation, the space she considered more valuable than her own son, now generated income that went directly into my pocket. And best of all, I found the perfect tenants. A family that, unlike mine, truly cared about each other. A couple with 2 young children looking for a place to start over. When they signed the lease, I felt everything come full circle with the perfection of a completed story. The house that was once the scene of the worst betrayal I had experienced was now a space of happiness for someone else. And my mother, meanwhile, remained lost in despair. From what I learned through distant relatives, she never managed to recover from the blow. She moved from house to house, depending on the charity of friends and acquaintances, unable to support herself. Her reputation was shattered after my brother's scandal, which meant many doors were closed to her. And although she didn't face legal charges like him, the mark of having been involved in his fraud never completely disappeared. My brother, on the other hand, got what he deserved. His case moved faster than expected, and he was found guilty on multiple counts of fraud. He didn't have the money to pay for a decent defense, and no one, not even my mother, could help him. He was sentenced to several years in prison, a sentence that honestly seemed too light to me compared to the damage he had caused. Do I regret anything? No. I don't regret ignoring my mother's pleas. I don't regret watching from a distance as she fell apart. And I certainly don't regret keeping the house. If I learned anything from this experience, it's that there are people who don't understand the value of what they have until they lose it. And there are those who believe they can trample on others without consequences, only to realize too late that fate always finds a way to balance the scales. I did nothing to cause their downfall. I just walked away and let them follow the path they chose. The difference was that when the house collapsed, I had a solid foundation to rebuild myself. They, on the other hand, never learned to support themselves. And now, as I continue to move forward in my life, I know their story is behind me, not because I have forgiven them, but because they simply don't matter anymore. They chose their destiny and I finally chose mine.